Hello, everybody. So this is the first video lecture of the chapter on gender and sexuality for psychology. And this is a tough one for me because I also teach, this topic also is in the sociology chapter. And many years ago, I taught a whole class on the topic of sex and gender. So it's a challenge for me to limit it to the psychological perspective. I have a tendency to want to talk about all other aspects of sexuality and gender and these kinds of things. So but it's a very important chapter, and I want to acknowledge that different people in the class audience are at different stages in the life course. Some of you may still be in high school, others of you may have teenagers yourself and have already gone through all the various stages. So it's going to be kind of a challenge to make sure that I provide information that's meaningful and relevant to everybody at their various stages in the life course. Which also draws me to another point, and that is how we talk about sex and how we're comfortable or not comfortable with the topic of sex, and how our values, those are all influenced. There's generational differences. For instance, if we were all together, I might ask you if you know what the most sexually promiscuous decade was in the last 100 years. What decade would you speculate had the biggest, or there was more extramarital sexual activity than any other decade? You might say the 60s, you might say the 20s. In fact, it was the 1970s. And the reason for this is that has to do with some social changes that include the decriminalization, or the legalization, if you will, of contraception for women. In 1972 or 73, I forget exactly which year it was, the law changed that allowed unmarried women to get contraceptives from their doctor legally. Up until this point, an unmarried woman could not legally get it at all. And a woman, if she was married, had to get permission from her husband. My mom likes to tell the story. My mother is currently 73. So if you know 73-year-olds, this would have been their story too. She tells the story about how after she and my father got married and after I was born, she had to get permission from my father for her to get birth control. Right. And so what happens in the early 70s, you have this legalization, and you have the legalization of abortion. And for the first time, women could have sex for fun without running any risks of getting pregnant. That decade then, and so that was how my parents. So I came of age in a household where sex was not dirty, it was not taboo, it was one of the great things about being a human. Sex was the way you showed you had fun with people and you made each other feel good. And so my father would say things at the dinner table like he didn't understand why violence was considered more acceptable. Like, why did violence get a PG-13 rating, but sex got an R rating? And so this is how I'm socialized, right? So this is part of my worldview as well. But the following decade, the decade of the 80s, saw a fairly radical, significant chilling of our sexuality, and that was because of AIDS. So come upon the 1990s, and you have this big fear, and so between the generation of the 70s and the 80s to the 90s and the 2000s, sexual attitudes have changed quite a bit, and sexual practices. Today, we're really in an era where the conversation is more about one's gender expression and one's identity, more so than just, if it feels good, do it kind of thing. So anyway, so you get some generational differences. It is important to talk about sex and to talk about it with the correct language. Research tells us that more you know about it, especially for young people, the more sexually active, the sooner they're likely to be sexually active, but they're also going to be safer because they know what they're doing. They know how to protect themselves. They know how to talk about it. They know that no means no, stop means stop kind of thing. In this chapter, I do not intend to sort of persuade your way of thinking. That's not what I'm talking about. I don't, however, it's also important that I do not present it in a way that sexuality is taboo or dirty, but I want to offer the research, the language, in a way that helps us deepen our understanding, deepen our own perspectives, our own value perspectives. And ultimately, it's important to me as an instructor, as a social scientist, and as a human, that I promote understanding. And it would be great if I could also promote acceptance, but that might be beyond the scope of what we do in a psychology class. So, but certainly let's work to understand our human differences and our human similarities. So, if we were together, and this would be true in both my psych and my social class, I would ask you, how many sexes are there? And most groups will say, well, there's only two, there's male and female. And then I would say, well, how do you define male and female? And people might say, they might get male and female confused with masculine and feminine. Masculine and feminine refer to one's expression of one's sexuality. And that's really more gender, and that's for a couple slides down the road. But we might talk about, penises and vaginas. And then I would suggest to you, some people are actually born where it's not clear if they have a penis or a vagina. Those people are referred to as intersexed. That term used to be hermaphrodite, but today the acceptable, or the term that's considered appropriate today is intersexed. So then we might say, well, what if we use genes? What if we use chromosomes, the X and the Y, right? Well, even if I use X and Y to determine the number of sexes there are, well, in that case, there's still six, because the ideal variations of X and Y chromosome is two X's for girls, and the X is larger, so that means that women carry more genetic information, and an X and a Y for a man. I hope you already know this. I hope you learned this in your biology class, but sex is determined by the father, right? All girls, all mothers give their offspring an X chromosome, because that's all she's got. All she's got is X chromosome. And it is the father, by way of his sperm, he gives an X or a Y. If he gives an X, then you have a baby girl. If he gives a Y, then you have a baby boy. But in some cases, there are other variations. And you could call these disorders, you can use whatever language you want, but for our purposes, I want to call these variations in sex genes, right, in sex chromosomes. So one variation is something called a Turner, and that is an X and an O. People that have an X and an O typically they look female. This image here, of this person, of the sketch right here, this is a Turner syndrome. And syndrome refers to a collection of characteristics. That's why they call them syndromes, right? So a Turner girl, they will look feminine, they'll look like girls, they will be unsterile. They'll sometimes be characterized by sort of what they call it, a webbed neck. Their nipples are often spread out. But one of the characteristics of Turner people is they're very short. Apparently they're like really short, like less than 5 feet, 4 feet 6 inches, something like this. Another variation is something called a Klinefelter syndrome. And that's what the tall image here, the image here on the left, or this is a Klinefelter. And these individuals, because they have the Y, they look masculine. So they look outwardly like boys, like men. They're characterized as being unusually tall. They often they have wider hips. So they're described as, because they have that X chromosome, right? They carry weight sort of similar to how women would. So what's interesting about all of these differences is they often carry some sort of cognitive impairment, and I want to say almost exclusively they're incapable of reproducing. They're infertile. I'm sorry, Klinefelter. A third variation is something called an XYY. And this one, so in the next activity, I'll have some videos when it describes all of these in a little bit better detail, and I ask you for your thoughts on them. But the XYY one was discovered many years ago, and it made its way into the popular media and the popular press. And there's superhero characters, the super male criminal gene. And it's thought to, or it was originally discovered in um, mental institutions, and so it was speculated that this additional gene or this additional chromosome made people criminal and violent, and that's since been discredited. And then a third one is referred to as trisomy X. So back to my original question, how many sexes are there? Well, I'm going to argue that there's more than two. Our culture, and this is where the next slide, where we talk about gender, right? Well, actually, two slides from now, where we talk about gender is how we interact in the world, right? According to our interaction, there are two, right? You have the feminine version of things, and you have the masculine version of things. But I'm going to stop right here and just leave it as the wide variety. And then in the videos, in the videos that I've linked up, it gives you some sort of sense as to how common these variations in the sex chromosome is.